For years, country music fans quietly assumed these voices were gone. No farewell tours, no headlines, no final goodbye, just silence. Nashville moved on, radio stopped calling, and time did the rest. But in 2026, the truth is far more unsettling. These old country singers never died. They simply faded from view while the world forgot they were still alive. Mo Bandy. For a certain generation of country fans, Mo Bandy's voice once felt unavoidable. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, his honky-tonk sound poured out of jukeboxes, truck radios, and roadside bars across America. He didn't chase crossover fame or polish his edges for pop appeal. Mo Bandy sang about cheating hearts, baroom regrets, and broken promises with a blunt honesty that felt almost old-fashioned even then. And for a while, that authenticity made him one of the most reliable hitmakers in country music. His rise was steady rather than explosive. Songs like Bandy the Rodeo Clown, It's a Cheatin' Situation, and I Cheated Me Right Out of You landed him firmly on the charts. Duets with Joe Stampley became staples of classic country radio. Mo wasn't marketed as a glamorous star. He was sold as the real thing, a working-class voice for people who recognized their own lives in his lyrics. During his peak years, he seemed like someone who would always be there, forever tied to the sound of traditional country music. Then Nashville changed. By the mid-1980s, radio began favoring smoother production, younger faces, and a more polished image. The raw honky-tonk style that had defined Mo Bandy's career suddenly felt inconvenient to an industry chasing broader audiences. His chart presence faded, record labels lost interest, and the invitations grew quieter. There was no dramatic collapse, no scandal, no farewell tour. Mo Bandy simply slipped out of the spotlight, almost unnoticed by a music industry that had already moved on. Over time, silence did what headlines never could. New generations stopped hearing his name. His songs disappeared from mainstream playlists. Gradually, many fans assumed the worst. When an artist vanishes completely, people often fill the gap with one conclusion: he must be gone. By the 2000s, Mo Bandy had quietly joined that category of singers people spoke about in the past tense. But in 2026, the truth tells a different story. Mo Bandy is still alive. He lives away from the noise, occasionally performing for loyal fans who remember what he meant to classic country. There are no big comeback campaigns, no attempts to reclaim lost fame. Just a man who once defined an era, still breathing, still here, long after the industry stopped paying attention. Mo Bandy didn't die. He was simply forgotten while still alive. Bobby Bare. Bobby Bare was never the loudest voice in the room, but for decades, he was one of the most respected. In an era when country music often relied on simple heartbreak formulas, Bare stood out as a storyteller. His songs didn't just rhyme. They unfolded like short films, filled with flawed characters, quiet desperation, and uncomfortable truths. During the 1960s and 1970s, his voice carried a calm authority that made listeners stop and actually pay attention. His breakthrough came with songs like Detroit City and 500 Miles Away from Home, tracks that captured loneliness and displacement with striking restraint. Later, his collaborations with songwriter Shel Silverstein pushed country music into strange, intelligent territory. Albums like Lullabies, Legends and Lies, and The Winner and Other Losers proved that country could be witty, dark, and deeply human at the same time. Bobby Bare wasn't chasing trends. He was shaping a quieter, smarter lane of the genre. At his peak, Bare earned Grammy recognition and industry respect, even if he never fit the traditional country star mold. He didn't look like a heartthrob, didn't perform with exaggerated emotion, and rarely played the celebrity game. That, ironically, became part of the problem later on. As Nashville shifted toward image-driven marketing and stadium-sized personalities, Bobby Bare's understated presence became easy to overlook. By the 1980s, his visibility began to fade. Radio support dried up. Record labels moved on to younger artists with flashier appeal. Unlike some of his peers, Bare didn't fight loudly for relevance. He didn't reinvent himself for pop success or stage dramatic comebacks. Instead, he stepped back, content to write, perform occasionally, and live outside the constant churn of the industry. There was no scandal, no downfall, just a slow, quiet disappearance. As years passed, silence did its work again. Bobby Bare's name stopped appearing in conversations about modern country history. His songs survived among hardcore fans, but the man behind them seemed to vanish. For many casual listeners, the assumption became automatic. Bobby Bare must have passed away long ago. That assumption went largely unchallenged because no one was looking for him anymore. Yet in 2026, Bobby Bare is still alive. He lives far from the spotlight, his legacy preserved more in liner notes and memories than in headlines. His influence remains woven into country songwriting, even if his name rarely surfaces. Bobby Bare didn't exit the world. He simply exited the noise. He didn't die forgotten. He was forgotten while still alive. T.G. Sheppard. For a brief but powerful stretch of time, T.G. Sheppard was everywhere. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, his voice dominated country radio with a consistency few artists could match. Smooth, confident, and unmistakably commercial, Sheppard represented a new kind of country star, polished enough for mainstream success, but still rooted in traditional themes of love, loss, and longing. For Nashville, he seemed like a perfect formula that would last for decades. His success came fast and hard. Songs like Devil in the Bottle, Last Cheater's Waltz, and I Loved 'Em Every One stacked up #1 hits in rapid succession. At one point, T.G. Sheppard placed an astonishing run of consecutive singles at the top of the charts, a feat that made him look untouchable. He wasn't just successful, he was reliable, the kind of artist labels trusted to deliver hits on demand. But that reliability hid a quiet vulnerability. Sheppard's image was carefully managed, his sound tailored to fit radio expectations of the era. When country music began shifting again in the mid to late 1980s, leaning either towards slick pop country or a raw neo-traditional movement, his style suddenly felt caught in between. He wasn't edgy enough for the rebels, and he wasn't young enough for the new generation. Nashville was eager to promote. The industry's response was swift and unemotional. Radio support faded, chart placements slipped, record labels quietly reduced their investment. There was no public fall from grace, no scandal to explain his disappearance. One year he was a chart fixture. A few years later, he was barely mentioned. For an artist who had once defined commercial country success, the silence felt abrupt and unforgiving. As time passed, that silence hardened into assumption. New listeners rarely encountered his music, unless they actively searched for it. His name disappeared from documentaries, playlists, and anniversary retrospectives. Gradually, many fans came to believe he must have died, because in the modern country conversation, he simply no longer existed. But in 2026, T.G. Sheppard is still alive. He continues to perform selectively, living a life far removed from the relentless pace that once defined his career. There are no grand revival campaigns, no attempts to reclaim his former dominance, just the quiet presence of a man who once ruled country radio, now living beyond its reach. T.G. Sheppard didn't fade because he failed. He faded because Nashville stopped needing him. Lee Greenwood. For millions of Americans, Lee Greenwood is tied to a single, unmistakable moment in history. His voice became inseparable from patriotism, national pride, and a certain vision of country music that surged through the 1980s. At his peak, Greenwood wasn't just a singer, he was a symbol. His songs played at rallies, ceremonies, and televised events, embedding his name into the cultural memory of an entire generation. But that kind of association can be both a blessing and a trap. While God Bless the USA elevated Greenwood to national recognition, it also slowly narrowed how the industry and the public saw him. Behind the anthem was a versatile country singer with chart-topping hits like Somebody's Gonna Love You and Dixie Road. For years, Lee Greenwood was a consistent presence on country radio, balancing mainstream success with traditional appeal. As the years passed, however, the spotlight tightened. Greenwood became increasingly defined by one song, one image, one role. When country music shifted again in the 1990s, Nashville's priorities changed. New stars emerged, sounds evolved, and the industry's appetite for politically charged symbolism grew selective. Greenwood didn't collapse. He was simply edged out of the mainstream conversation. Unlike artists who faded due to scandal or self-destruction, Greenwood's disappearance was almost clinical. Radio stopped calling. Award shows stopped inviting. His name slowly vanished from playlists and retrospectives, replaced by newer voices that fit the era better. Over time, his career became reduced to a footnote, the man behind a patriotic anthem frozen in the past. That reduction had an unintended consequence. As Greenwood withdrew from constant public exposure, many assumed he had passed away. His absence felt total. Outside of national holidays or archival clips, there was little reminder that he still existed as a living artist. The man had become an echo, replayed only when the calendar demanded it. Yet in 2026, Lee Greenwood is still alive. He lives quietly, performing selectively, far from the nonstop attention he once commanded. There is no push to reclaim his former place on the charts, no attempt to rewrite his legacy. His life now exists beyond radio metrics and cultural debates, grounded in a personal sense of purpose rather than public approval. Lee Greenwood didn't vanish because he was forgotten overnight. He vanished because history chose to remember only one part of him. And while the world replayed his voice from the past, the man himself continued living in the present. Crystal Gayle. For a long time, Crystal Gayle represented a rare kind of elegance in country music. While others leaned into grit or heartbreak, she carried herself with quiet control and unmistakable poise. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, her voice, smooth, restrained, and emotionally precise, felt like a bridge between traditional country and a more polished adult sound. At her peak, Crystal Gayle wasn't just successful. She was everywhere. Songs like Don't It Make My Brown Eyes Blue, Talking in Your Sleep, and Why Have You Left the One You Left Me For turned her into a crossover star without ever fully abandoning her country roots. She won major awards, sold millions of records, and became one of the most recognizable female voices of her era. Her image was instantly identifiable: long hair, soft lighting, and a calm presence that contrasted sharply with the louder personalities around her. But that very restraint would later work against her. As country music moved into the 1990s, the industry shifted toward bolder personas and more aggressive branding. Crystal Gayle didn't reinvent herself, didn't chase controversy, and didn't compete for attention. Instead, she stepped back, not abruptly, but deliberately. Touring slowed. New releases became rare. Media appearances almost disappeared. There was no scandal to explain her absence. No dramatic career-ending moment. She simply chose a quieter life, away from the machinery of Nashville. And in an industry that thrives on constant visibility, quiet often gets mistaken for disappearance. Over time, her name stopped coming up in conversations about current country music. Younger audiences rarely encountered her songs unless they stumbled across old playlists or late-night radio programs. That absence led to a strange assumption. Because Crystal Gayle wasn't seen, wasn't heard, and wasn't talked about, many fans quietly concluded she must have passed away. The idea spread subtly, not through headlines, but through silence. When an artist vanishes completely, the public often fills in the blanks on its own. But in 2026, Crystal Gayle is still alive. She lives privately, far removed from the pace and noise that once surrounded her. She performs occasionally, on her own terms, without chasing relevance or attention. There are no comeback tours, no attempts to re-enter the spotlight she willingly left behind. Crystal Gayle didn't fade because she was pushed out. She faded because she chose peace over permanence. And in doing so, she became one more country legend the world quietly assumed was gone, while she was still very much alive. Jeannie Seely. Jeannie Seely was never supposed to be quiet. From the moment she broke through in the late 1960s, her voice carried a confidence that cut through Nashville's carefully managed image of women in country music. She didn't sound fragile or submissive. She sounded certain. Songs like Don't Touch Me made her a star not because they begged for sympathy, but because they demanded respect. For a brief moment, Jeannie Seely felt like a turning point. Her success came quickly. She became a fixture on country radio and a regular presence at the Grand Ole Opry, earning admiration for both her vocal strength and her refusal to fit neatly into expectations. Seely dressed differently, spoke openly, and sang with an emotional clarity that felt ahead of its time. She wasn't chasing controversy, but she wasn't interested in pleasing anyone either. That independence made her stand out, and later made her expendable. As the years went on, the industry shifted again. Country music leaned harder into image, youth, and marketable narratives. Female artists were often pushed into narrow lanes, and Jeannie Seely didn't fit comfortably into any of them. While newer stars rose with carefully crafted personas, Seely's career quietly stalled. Radio support faded. Record deals became inconsistent. There was no public rejection, just a gradual closing of doors. Unlike many artists who disappeared completely, Jeannie Seely never fully left. She remained connected to the Grand Ole Opry, continuing to perform long after her chart success ended. But outside that circle, she slowly vanished from public awareness. Her name stopped appearing in documentaries. Her songs stopped resurfacing in retrospectives. To newer generations, she became invisible, a name rarely spoken, a voice rarely heard. That invisibility led to assumption. Fans who remembered her from decades earlier often asked the same question in passing: is she still alive? The fact that the question could linger unanswered said everything. Jeannie Seely hadn't been mourned, celebrated, or revisited. She had simply been erased from the broader conversation, replaced by louder stories and flashier legacies. Yet in 2026, Jeannie Seely is still alive. She remains one of the longest-serving members of the Grand Ole Opry, quietly holding a place in country music history that few acknowledge anymore. There is no comeback narrative, no dramatic rediscovery, just endurance. Jeannie Seely didn't disappear because she failed. She disappeared because the industry forgot how to make space for women like her. And while the world assumed she was gone, she kept showing up long after the spotlight moved elsewhere. John Anderson never sounded like anyone else, and for a while, that difference made him indispensable. When he emerged in the late 1970s and early 1980s, his sharp, nasal twang cut straight through country radio. It wasn't smooth, it wasn't polite. It sounded rural, stubborn, and unapologetically Southern, exactly what many fans felt country music was supposed to be. At his peak, Anderson didn't just fit the genre. He reminded it where it came from. Songs like Swingin', Black Sheep, and Seminole Wind turned him into a defining voice of his era. He sang about outsiders, working-class pride, and the quiet anger of people left behind by progress. His music carried a tension that felt real, not manufactured. For a time, Nashville embraced that authenticity, and John Anderson stood as proof that traditional country could still command massive attention. But authenticity is a fragile currency in a changing industry. As the 1990s approached, country music began reshaping itself again. Smoother, younger, more commercially flexible. Anderson's sound didn't soften, and his image didn't evolve to match the new expectations. What once made him unique slowly made him inconvenient. Radio airplay thinned. Chart success became sporadic. The industry's interest cooled without explanation. Unlike artists whose decline came with scandal or self-destruction, Anderson's fade was quiet. He didn't burn bridges. He didn't implode publicly. He simply found himself outside the spotlight as Nashville redirected its focus elsewhere. To fans, it felt sudden. One decade, he was essential. The next, he was rarely mentioned. As years passed, his absence hardened into invisibility. New listeners rarely encountered his name. His songs survived mostly on classic country stations or among devoted fans who actively sought them out. For everyone else, John Anderson slipped into that strange cultural limbo reserved for artists who vanish without closure. Eventually, many assumed the obvious conclusion: he must be gone. That assumption spread not through news, but through neglect. When an artist stops appearing anywhere, no interviews, no tributes, no mainstream acknowledgement, the public fills in the blanks. By the 2010s, John Anderson was spoken about almost exclusively in the past tense. But in 2026, John Anderson is still alive. He continues to exist beyond the industry that once celebrated him, performing selectively and living far from the machinery that abandoned him. There are no dramatic comeback arcs, no attempts to reclaim his former position. Just a man who once shaped the sound of country music, now living quietly after being pushed to its margins. John Anderson didn't disappear because his voice failed. He disappeared because country music stopped listening. And while the genre moved on, he remained, forgotten, but still very much alive. Gene Watson. Among hardcore country fans, Gene Watson's voice has long been treated with near reverence. Pure, controlled, and emotionally precise, it was the kind of voice other singers quietly studied rather than tried to imitate. In the 1970s and early 1980s, Watson stood as a standard bearer for traditional country singing. Not flashy, not theatrical, but devastatingly honest. For a while, his presence on the charts felt almost permanent. Songs like Farewell Party, Love in the Hot Afternoon, and 14 Karat Mind showcased a vocal ability that few could match. Watson didn't rely on gimmicks or crossover appeal. He sang heartbreak straight, without irony or polish, and listeners believed every word. Industry insiders often described him as a singer's singer, respected deeply, even if he never chased superstardom. But respect doesn't always translate into survival. As country music entered the late 1980s and 1990s, Nashville's priorities shifted sharply. Image, youth, and marketability began to outweigh vocal excellence. Gene Watson didn't change his sound, didn't soften his delivery, and didn't reinvent himself for radio trends. What had once been his greatest strength slowly became a liability. His chart presence faded without drama. Radio airplay dropped. Record deals became less secure. There was no scandal, no public implosion, no clear moment when everything ended. Instead, Watson experienced something more common and more brutal in the music industry: indifference. He continued recording and performing, but increasingly outside the mainstream spotlight. Over time, his absence from popular conversation created a dangerous illusion. Because Gene Watson was no longer visible in media, documentaries, or award retrospectives, many listeners quietly assumed he had passed away. His most famous songs lived on in classic country circles, but the man behind them seemed to vanish entirely. Silence replaced curiosity. That silence lasted for decades. New generations of country fans rarely encountered his name unless they actively explored the genre's past. Even then, Watson was often treated as a historical figure rather than a living artist. The assumption hardened. Surely someone so quiet must be gone. Yet in 2026, Gene Watson is still alive. He continues to perform selectively, especially for audiences that value traditional country music in its purest form. There are no major comebacks, no media campaigns, no attempt to reclaim a place Nashville no longer offers. His career now exists outside the industry's approval system altogether. Gene Watson didn't disappear because he lacked talent. He disappeared because talent alone stopped being enough. And while country music chased reinvention, one of its greatest voices continued singing, unheard by most, but still very much alive. Popstar Bill Anderson. For decades, Bill Anderson seemed impossible to escape. He wasn't just a singer. He was a songwriter, a television personality, a radio host, and one of Nashville's most dependable figures. His gentle voice and soft-spoken delivery earned him the nickname Whispering Bill, a label that perfectly captured both his sound and his presence. In the 1960s and 1970s, Anderson was not merely part of country music's landscape. He was one of its pillars. His early success came through songs like Still, Po' Folks, and Mama Sang a Song. These weren't loud anthems or dramatic showstoppers. They were quiet, emotional reflections on everyday life, the kind of songs that felt deeply personal without ever trying too hard. As a songwriter, Bill Anderson's influence went even further. His compositions were recorded by some of the biggest names in country music, embedding his words into the genre's foundation. Unlike many artists of his era, Anderson adapted early. He became a familiar face on television, hosting and appearing on shows that brought country music into American living rooms. For years, his visibility never truly faded. Even when his chart success slowed, his presence remained constant. He felt eternal, the kind of figure people assumed would always be there, quietly holding things together behind the scenes. But time has a way of reshaping perception. As country music modernized and media fragmented, Bill Anderson's multi-role relevance slowly diminished. Television opportunities faded, radio exposure narrowed, his songwriting continued, but often without public recognition. To younger audiences, his name became unfamiliar. To older fans, he became someone remembered fondly, but spoken about as if he belonged entirely to the past. The shift was subtle, but powerful. Anderson didn't collapse or retreat dramatically. He stayed active, continued writing, and remained respected within industry circles. Yet outside Nashville, he slowly disappeared from public consciousness. His calm presence, once a strength, made his absence easy to miss. Without scandal or tragedy to mark his decline, many simply stopped noticing him altogether. That disappearance created a quiet misconception. When an artist fades without noise, the public often assumes the most final explanation. Over the years, more and more listeners came to believe Bill Anderson had passed away. His songs lived on in archives and memories. but the man himself felt distant, frozen in an earlier era. But in 2026, Bill Anderson is still alive. He continues to write, to appear selectively, and to exist as one of country music's most enduring contributors. His career didn't end with a headline or a farewell. It simply receded into the background, where legends often go unnoticed. Bill Anderson didn't vanish because he was forgotten overnight. He vanished because quiet longevity rarely captures attention. And while the world assumed he was gone, one of country music's most influential voices kept whispering on: Ray Stevens. Ray Stevens was never supposed to be taken lightly, and that may be exactly why history stopped taking him seriously. From the very beginning, his career sat in an uncomfortable space between comedy and craftsmanship. He was funny, sharp, and absurd on the surface, but underneath the humor was a musician with real technical skill and a deep understanding of American culture. For years, Ray Stevens was one of the most recognizable voices in country-adjacent music. In the late 1960s and 1970s, his songs dominated airwaves. Tracks like Everything is Beautiful and The Streak weren't novelty flukes, they were cultural events. Stevens had the rare ability to capture national moods with humor that felt immediate and relatable. Audiences laughed, radio played him endlessly, and television embraced him as a safe, entertaining presence. At his peak, he was everywhere. But comedy ages faster than sincerity. As decades passed, the industry began to box Ray Stevens into a single category: novelty act. That label quietly erased the complexity of his career. His serious songwriting, musicianship, and cultural commentary were overshadowed by punchlines and costumes. Nashville moved on, and Stevens found himself frozen in time, remembered not as an artist, but as a joke people used to laugh at. By the 1980s and 1990s, mainstream attention faded. Stevens continued performing and recording, often to loyal audiences, but outside the spotlight. His name stopped appearing in serious conversations about country music history. Documentaries skipped over him. Playlists reduced him to a punchline or ignored him entirely. Slowly, he vanished from the broader cultural memory. That vanishing had consequences. When an artist is remembered only through old clips and outdated humor, people begin to assume he belongs entirely to the past. Over time, many fans came to believe Ray Stevens had died. The assumption wasn't fueled by rumor or tragedy. It grew from neglect. No interviews, no headlines, no public narrative to contradict the silence. Yet in 2026, Ray Stevens is still alive. He lives quietly, performing selectively, and maintaining control over his legacy in his own way. There is no attempt to reclaim relevance or reframe his career for modern audiences. He exists outside the cycle of reinvention, content to let history misunderstand him. Ray Stevens didn't disappear because he lacked talent. He disappeared because humor made it easy to dismiss him. And while the world laughed, then forgot, one of country music's most unusual figures continued living. Long after people assumed he was gone, Mel Tillis. Mel Tillis spent his entire career proving people wrong. Long before audiences knew his songs, they noticed his stutter, a speech impediment so pronounced that it shaped how the world saw him. In conversation, he struggled. On stage, speaking was difficult. But when Mel Tillis sang, the stutter vanished completely. His voice flowed effortlessly, revealing a songwriter and performer whose talent stood in sharp contrast to the assumptions made about him. In the 1960s and 1970s, Tillis became one of Nashville's most prolific songwriters. His compositions were recorded by country's biggest names, turning him into a quiet force behind the scenes before he ever became a star himself. When he did step into the spotlight, songs like I Ain't Never, Good Woman Blues, and Coca-Cola Cowboy made him a household name. He wasn't flashy or fashionable, but he was unmistakably authentic. At his peak, Mel Tillis embodied an old-school country ideal: humor mixed with heartbreak, humility mixed with sharp observation. He won major awards, hosted television shows, and became a familiar face on country music stages. Audiences admired him not just for his songs, but for his resilience. His stutter, once seen as a limitation, became part of his identity, a symbol of perseverance rather than weakness. But time changed the industry, as it always does. By the late 1980s, Nashville shifted toward younger faces and slicker production. Tillis's brand of traditional storytelling began to feel out of place. Radio support faded. Television appearances slowed. His presence receded without controversy or drama. For an artist who had once seemed indestructible, the quietness was striking. As years passed, Mel Tillis withdrew further from public life. Health issues and age encouraged a slower pace, and his visibility dropped almost to zero. New generations rarely encountered his name unless they explored classic country intentionally. Gradually, a familiar assumption took hold. Mel Tillis must be gone. The absence felt permanent enough to suggest it. That assumption lingered largely unchallenged. There were no headlines announcing his continued presence, no comeback narratives to remind the public he was still here. His songs survived, but the man himself faded into memory. In the cultural imagination, he belonged to a closed chapter of country history. Yet, in 2026, Mel Tillis is still alive. He lives quietly, removed from the industry he helped shape. There are no attempts to reclaim relevance, no desire to correct public assumptions. His legacy exists independently of recognition, anchored in songs that outlived his visibility. Mel Tillis didn't disappear because his voice failed. He disappeared because the world stopped looking. And while many assumed his story had ended, he continued living long after country music moved on.